Hi, guys. Talking about the war in the Pacific, it's important to understand that at first, the United States did not look that great in the military aspect of the Pacific War. And it starts with, of course, the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, which sort of gave the indication that maybe the United States was unprepared. But certainly, in the initial battles, the first few battles of the Pacific War, the United States did not militarily do very well. However, it wasn't until the Battle of Midway, which you saw the other night in June, that the tide began to turn. And in fact, many people would say that Midway was the turning point in the Pacific War because it showed that the United States could actually defeat a what at the time they thought was a superior Japanese navy. After Midway, the United States began what they would call a strategy of island hopping. And this is just when the United States would advance towards Japan uh, by island by island, meaning that they would not jump, from 500 miles at a time. They would go slowly. We'll first occupy one island, a small little island that might not seem very significant with natural resources or anything, but it was one step closer to Japan. And then you get another island that was even closer to Japan, and so on and so forth. And as you got closer to Japan, you would get more and more resistance. And the idea behind island hopping is that you could actually skip some of the more heavily fortified islands and attack the weaker ones. And this was a very, very successful method. But it was also very, very costly, as you saw the other day. Some videos about how difficult the fighting was in the Pacific. The Japanese were certainly going to fight very, very hard. By October 44, most of the land that Japan had taken, had captured from other Pacific areas, was recaptured. Perhaps the ones that there have been many, many movies about. Classic one called The Sands of Iwo Jima, and of course you've probably heard of Flags of Our Fathers or Letters from Iwo Jima. And of course it's most iconic for the flag raising, of course on Mount Suribachi. But Iwo Jima, of course, most iconic island perhaps in World War II. Rocky volcanic island, 21,000 Japanese troops on the island. They had caves, they had tunnels, they mounted a fierce resistance, and it was very difficult. It was volcanic terrain, hot. It would burn you. It would get in your eyes, your shoes, everything. Very, very tough fighting. And after 20 days, finally the USA was able to capture Iwo Jima with the iconic raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi. And this is a modern day, well, not exactly today, probably a few years back, view of that. Okinawa. This was a very important battle. You see how close it is there to mainland Japan. Whoops, that was weird. See how close it is there to mainland Japan. And it was really the last stop. In terms of island hopping, you really couldn't get much closer to Japan than Okinawa. And this battle was a 2 month battle. And of course, again, the island very, very close to Japan. Fighting was very, very heavy on land and sea. One of the things that sometimes gets or doesn't get talked about enough is the terrible weather. Certainly the weather at sea with storms and things like that, but also on land can make fighting very, very difficult. And soldiers were subjected to terrible weather. Sailors had to deal with the feared kamikaze attacks, where pilots would just fly their planes directly into military targets. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. This is just one battle. This is just on the island of Okinawa that 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. And unfortunately, about a quarter of the civilian population died as well. This, of course, was nowhere near the cost of mainland Japan. And this is where some people are very either critical of the United States or critical of Japan. Even though defeat was absolutely inevitable, Japan still refused to surrender. Now, the United States, had virtually no resistance. They were flying bombing missions with no Japanese fighters to try to challenge the American air superiority, and the USA started to conventional bomb Tokyo and other cities. These sort of bombs, they're called fire bombs because they would be incendiary and they'd burn much of the wooden structure, really, that much of Japan was built at the time. Devastating fire bombs created literally hell on earth, and there's stories about people trying to hide in canals, or small little streams, and just the water being evaporated because it got so hot and created these firestorms. This firebombing killed nearly 900,000 over a 5-month period, and still there was no surrender. So if you add, Okinawa, the 100,000 Okinawa, you know, plus the 900,000 in Japan, mainland Japan, that's a million people, and they're still not surrendering. And again, this idea that Japan just doesn't surrender, that was also in the back of many people's mind. Well, by the summer of 1945, Japan was considering surrender, but Japan was still unwilling to surrender unconditionally. The United States said, listen, you surrender, end of story. And Japan said, well, I don't know if we want to surrender yet. We are kind of concerned about the fate of the emperor. Um, some people will tell you that Japan was attempting to surrender. And again, I'm not 100% sure about how one attempts to surrender and is unsuccessful in doing so. It doesn't strike me as a particularly difficult uh, thing to do. I think if you're more concerned with other things like the status of your emperor, then that might be the issue. And so to phrase it as attempting to surrender, as opposed to holding out for a better deal, I think it's disingenuous to say that they were attempting to surrender. But that's the position that many historians have. And I guess you can make up your own mind on that. Another question to consider: how many U.S. troops would die if there was an invasion of Japan? Now remember the costly fighting in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and now fighting for your mainland, the mainland of Japan. And remember, these Japanese troops, they didn't have very many weapons left. They were actually being trained to sharpen bamboo sticks. And bamboo sticks versus tanks, not a good look. So another question is, how many Japanese would have died on a U.S. invasion? And another thing to think about: would using the bomb make the USA stronger or weaker in the future? What kind of message would it send to potential adversaries like the strengthening Soviet Union? All right, thanks so much for listening.